Welcome to becoming a techno wizard. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna restart. I'm sorry. I just that was just 10 minutes that I was talking, summarizing, and then 5 minutes of this video. I'm already tired. I've already been procrastinating on doing this, so I'm just gonna keep it trucking. Sorry, barely anybody watches this, so it is what it is. If you're watching this later, just go back and watch the first or watch this first 5 minutes of this video yourself if you like or whatever. Basically, he's talking about uh dogmatism and how you kind of need that or see or he's referencing how dogmatism was kind of a given assumption for a lot of not just religion but also science, in that you need you're assuming, assume this holds true and then we can build off the foundation of that, right? It's kind of like a assumed keystone or cornerstone, I think he mentioned, of any sort of complex science or complex knowledge that you're trying to figure out. Like, for instance, in physics, you say assume a frictionless environment and then we can go into the different laws of physics and say, okay, inertia, this, that, and the other. But of course there is no such thing as a frictionless environment, not even in space, right? In space with a vacuum, you still have the friction of of solar, of light itself, can cause a little bit of friction. Um, and a lot of the laws of physics kind of assumes a perfect environment which doesn't exist, or environment where no other forces are interacting, and which again doesn't exist. So a lot of our science depends on some form of central dogma, if you will. So it's interesting that he's bringing this up in his paragraph on paragraph 40 of the preface. Let's begin. Let's continue.
The nature of a so-called truth of that kind, he says, is different from the nature of philosophical truths. When we're doing philosophy, we can't just stick with the positive. This is why positivism is actually not only a misguided way of understanding philosophy, it's a terrible thing to engage in because it leads you astray. It leads you away from the possibility of actually learning how to do genuine philosophy
Hmm.
by having the aim of only what can be measured, publicly verified, etc., etc., etc. You restrict yourself to what's inherently unphilosophical, Hegel would say.
Mm.
So, long story short, we want to avoid dogmatism in philosophy. Nothing wrong with true propositions that are fixed results or immediately known. It's just that they're not going to provide us with the sort of foundation or basis that we need in order to genuinely carry out the process and projects of philosophy.
Mm. I really like this idea too, because personally I've been finding this to be true as I've been trying to figure out a story of humanity. And I finally finished that, blog. I talked about it again in my podcast, but um my newsletter ended up being over 60 pages long. Mostly unintended, of like a new story of humanity, in which I get down to why we are where we are today. Like, why do we have so many big problems? Why do we have poverty and inequality and greed and pollution and all this problem? Like, why do we have all these problems, right? I get down to all of this, and that's not really a spoiler because I lay it out in the very beginning, is that at the foundations of all of our humanity's problems today is hierarchy, right? Is the idea that certain people have more decision making power than others, right? And that could be on the basis of so-called merit, of democracy, so-called, of voting people in, or of simply of wealth, right? Of having more money, of uh, military power, of political power, states, and all this other stuff. Like, there's so many ways in which or rather environments and factors that lead into that hierarchical power. But the fact is that in any place that you see a hierarchy, you see these problems, you see inequality, you see abuse, you see all these different things. And so I argue that it's actually not a problem of human nature, right? That we have these problems. Is actually a problem of the how human nature responds in these negative environments, right? So it's a more nuanced approach. And I spend like almost the first half, maybe the first third rather, of the newsletter, um, talking about human nature and talking about the fact that it's not a problem of human nature. And I bring this up because that is like a dogma, right? That people hold true. That is a thing that people say, oh, it's human nature, right? We'll never have be a better society because it's human nature. It's because of people are inherently greedy, people are inherently bad, evil, or whatever, right? But that is a dogma. That's an assumption that people are making, and that they claim is true. But if you just say, oh, assume, human nature is this is human nature, then that explains everything else about our world. Then I'm like, wait, but why do you make that assumption? You can't just assume, you know, uh, that humans are inherently greedy, this, that, and the other. Because when you look at the evidence, when you look into history, some anthropological evidence, you can actually see evidence of different societies living out in a different way, right? Where you actually had egalitarian societies. I've talked about this many times, so I won't go too much into it right now, but you've had egalitarian societies where people behaved inherently differently, right? Where people were inherently altruistic from the get go, from as young as possible, where they're inherently independent, where they helped each other out, they were cooperative and not competitive. Like, that's another thing. People say, oh, humans are inherently competitive. That's why we need this, that, and another. Well, no. Many of these societies, humans were inherently cooperative, right? And they still were very creative. They still were very innovative. So there's so many different things here about our lives in which we hold true simply because of the dogma of human nature, right? Regardless of you're religious or not, people hold this assumption to be true. And so I think that's why I really like this section, because it gets you to question that, like, is it is it really human nature? Like, what is human nature? What do we mean by that? So yeah, um, when you don't make these assumptions, you have to build a better foundation of knowledge, and that's incredibly powerful.
As regards historical truths, to mention these briefly, it will be readily granted that so far as their purely historical aspect is considered, they are concerned with a particular existence, with the contingent and arbitrary aspects of a given content, which have no necessity. But even such plain truths as those just illustrated are not without the movement of self-consciousness.
Mm,
To cognize one of them, a good deal of comparison is called for. Books must be consulted in some way, or other inquiry has to be made.
mhm.
Even an immediate intuition is held to have genuine value only when it is cognized as a fact along with its reasons, although it is probably only the bare result that we are supposed to be concerned about.
Mm. That was a short little
Only
section
the
there.
bare result only when it is cognized.
Matthew, welcome to the stream. Says, I think we are bipolar creatures. We contain both selfish and aggressive tendencies, but also altruistic and compassionate inclinations. Yeah, indeed, indeed. And how I put it, I want to say bipolar per se, because that implies, mental kind of health. And that's the actual condition people have. But I would definitely say that we have hold a propensity, obviously, for all of this, right? For great evil, great good, and all this other stuff. And in my newsletter and in general, I'd say it comes down to the environment, right? If anything, the core of human nature is just social, right? And that could be good or bad, right? If you're that social could be very um I don't want to use the word tribal, but people understand it to be, tribalism of coming together, not just and I say I think tribalism itself is similar to this. Like, it's a good example of this, rather, right? Like, with tribalism, you can come together and form a great community of people, right? You can have a tribe, and you it's like a friend group, it's like a brotherhood, a sisterhood, whatever. But you can also have a tribe that's like a cult and is very aggressive and all this other stuff. And the difference is the environment, right? And what makes and the environment is not just physical environment, that's a huge important part, but also the mental environment, right? What do people believe? What is your culture? What is your um um consequences of good and bad behavior? What types of behaviors are incentivized or punished, right? All these things determine what path people go down, like what personalities and what way that we go down in terms of whether or not we're selfish and aggressive, or we're compassionate and altruistic. So yeah, definitely I agree. And it's awesome stuff.
As a fact along with its reasons, although it is probably only the bare result that we are supposed to be concerned about.
Oh yeah, I wanted to talk about that, but it's fine. Let's continue.
In section 41, Hegel is going to speak very briefly about what he is calling historical geschichtliche truths. And by this, we should imagine something more than just what we tend to bring to mind when we think of the discipline of history. What he means by historical truths are anything that falls within the realm of the particular, the contingent, the arbitrary, that which actually has happened or people report to have happened. So you could think of a police report, for example, as falling under what he's calling historical truths, or an economics report as falling under that as well. And what is his concern in bringing this up? Historical truths, although philosophy is going to be grounded within the historical process and very interested in the great meaning underlying the historical process, philosophical truths are not going to be historical truths of the sort that he's outlining here. He says, it'll be readily granted that so far as their purely historical aspect is concerned, what makes them primarily historical, they have these three qualities. They are particular, that is, they bear upon particulars. They don't aim to tell us about or apply to things universally. That's when we actually take historical truths and then we generalize from them. When we do that, we're leaving the boundaries of history proper. So, for example, it's always popular to compare America or really any other nation that you like that is some sort of vast nation state encompassing a lot of disparate people with disparate beliefs to the Roman Republic and Empire and talk about its decline. The actual process of decline of the Roman Empire is something that is within the realm of historical truth. Extending that to the current American regime at any given time and making that comparison instead of comparing America to 1930s France, which would be an equally apt comparison. That is where you're extending things from that body of data and information that's been interpreted to some degree, which bears on a particular time, a particular set of people, particular events, and trying to generalize to another, admittedly, particular thing. If you were going to try to derive a general law of the rise and fall of peoples from the Roman Empire, what you're doing is you're trying to go from the particular to the universal. Aristotle criticized history rather backhandedly in his Poetics in saying that poetry was more philosophical than history, because history, historia, which was already a discipline by that time, focused on the particular. Focused on what had happened, focused on what was the case for individual particular things, and poetry looked to the universals. And you might say, well, how is that the case? I mean, Oedipus was one guy. Well, Oedipus somehow stands for something. Whereas it's not quite so easy with every historical circumstance to say exactly what it stands for. Contingent. Contingent means that things just happen to be that way. There could be causes, that somebody could have had some ideas in mind, but it's the realm of touche, of chance, of contingency. And arbitrary. Arbitrary goes beyond the contingent. And it's interesting that he uses this term arbitrary, willkürlich. Arbitras in Latin is closely connected with voluntas. Arbitras is sort of judgment or decision, and it's only beings that actually have some sort of free will that, a capacity to choose, to differentiate options and to say, I'm taking this one. It's only those that can make arbitrary decisions. So the arbitrary goes beyond the contingent. Willkürlich in German, arbitrary, goes beyond that as well, and involves the notion of the will. And history is in large part the product of volitions by people. And you can take other historical perspectives. You can take, the longue durée of the Annales, historians, and do economic analyses and say, well, people didn't really have any choice about the circumstances in which they worked. But this is one of the paradoxes of history, actually. We are dealing with beings that do make decisions. So Hegel says, look, as far as the historical goes, the purely historical, it's got these three things. Even such plain truths as those just illustrated, like when was Caesar born? He was born at this place at this time. Did he have asthma? Yes, he did. How did he overcome it? Doing calisthenics with the soldiers and spending time with them in the field. These are historical truths. He says, even such plain truths as those just illustrated are not without the movement of self-consciousness. And he doesn't spell this out particularly well in this section. And you can think of it as existing in two ways. What happened, which is what the historical truths are about, is the product of human self-consciousness in the past doing something, choosing something, thinking something, assuming something, coming to a judgment. engaging in cooperation or competition or agonistic, fighting with something else, overcoming itself, succumbing to something, giving in to temptation. Self-consciousness decides something, and something then happens as a result of that. So self-consciousness is involved there. But what we're doing as historically looking backward thinking beings, as the subject who is engaging history as a kind of knowledge, as a kind of object, is we are, what he says, cognizing it. We are thinking it. And when we think it, he says, there's two ways in which this goes. One is through what we call inquiry. We ask, what happened? And, if you think about the father of history, sometimes people want to say, well, he wasn't really the father of history, it was Thucydides instead. Let's just say Herodotus, because he used the word history. And Herodotus, maybe he made up some things, but he also went around and he asked people questions, and he also looked in archives, and he compared things. He wanted to figure out, how did these Persian wars take place? What was actually going on? What were the people, what were their decisions? What were their motivations? Let me find that stuff out. I'll actually talk to people. I'll carry out inquiry. And there we start getting a bit more philosophical, because we're inquiring into the reasons, the why. Why did things turn out the way that they did? That's going to take us outside of the realm of the merely historical, as Hegel sees it, and into something
Into
that's,
the philosophy.
if not philosophy, at least headed in that direction. So he says, even an immediate intuition is held to have genuine value only when it's cognized as a fact, along with its reasons. Facts, a lot of people want to accumulate facts. Particularly, they love statistics. This is a good thing to think about because we're moving into talking about mathematical cognition. Facts are contingent. Facts are arbitrary.
Yeah.
They don't do you any damn good unless you can actually put them into a network and say why they actually matter, how you know that they're actually true, whether we've actually, constituted them as facts, or whether they were sort of reading our desires into them. Unless you can come up with something beyond the mere fact, the thing that people, often want to go back to as a kind of idol, you don't really know anything. Somebody who only knows facts lacks actual knowledge, Hegel would say.
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. It's like, it goes back to the idea of, the difference between knowledge and wisdom, right? Knowing how to apply that knowledge and what situations and things like that. We see it all the time in every kind of, I guess, industry or situation, like in terms of careers and business, right? There's a difference between skills and expertise versus like strategy, right? Knowing not just having these skills and being able to do something, but knowing when to apply those skills and how to apply it in different situations and things like that. So I do like that kind of, I guess, demarcation between not just facts, but the reasoning behind those facts and how it's applied and where and all that other stuff and why we think it's a fact. Great stuff. Great stuff.
As for mathematical truths, we should be even less inclined to regard anyone as a geometer who knew Euclid's theorems outwardly by rote without knowing their proofs, without, as we might say, to point the contrast, knowing them inwardly.
Ooh.
Similar.
How many people know truths today in our math class? This is one of the reasons why I think we've made a mistake in saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to teach everybody math. We're going to be everybody's going to be literate." Because now, like, nobody's literate, right? We claim people can know math, but really they don't. Most people have no idea why the Pythagorean theorem is the way it is. Even though that's a whole section in school, most people have no idea how to prove the Pythagorean theorem, right? Most people don't even know what that math proof is, right? Like, I didn't know what that is until after I left high school and I started looking up on YouTube and reading theories about math. I didn't even realize you can prove like that 2 + 2 = 2 or 2 + 2 equals 4. Like, you can prove these things, but now, like, it's the idea that you can mass educate people um, is more on the idea that education and knowledge is a product rather than a process, right? The idea that you can mass educate people by just shoving facts into their head, right, divorces the whole process of reasoning, the whole process of you know understanding why and how and things like that. And it's no wonder that we complain that people don't have common sense and critical thinking because we don't teach that, right? We don't even engage that. We don't encourage that. In fact, we disincentivize that. We say, you want to ask why? Don't worry about that. If you don't have a good teacher, right? If your teacher doesn't have the time or the patience or the energy um to welcome your curiosity and your questioning about their curriculum and this, that, and the other, then they can like shut up and just do the work, right? It's terrible. But we know that, right? Matthew says now undergraduates just use check. Yeah, yeah. So even in college, right? It's supposed to be this higher learning, institution of higher learning. What we've done is just commoditized it, right? People go to college and they just play around and things like that. It just do their best to cheat their way through or something like that, and it's almost a joke. It's a tragedy because most people just get in debt and don't use anything from college. Matthew continues, proof writing in math today is undervalued by the mainstream. Indeed, that's another great point right there, man. It's it really is tragic what's happening with our entire education system and entire society, and I think a lot of it comes from the fact that we've commoditized the very process of learning and education and knowledge.
If someone became aware through measuring a number of right-angled triangles that their sides do in fact have the well-known relation to one another, we should consider his mere awareness of that fact unsatisfactory. Yet even in mathematical cognition, the essentiality of the proof does not have the significance and nature of being a moment of the result itself. When the latter is reached, the demonstration is over and has disappeared. It is, of course, as a result that the theorem is something seen to be true, but this added circumstance has no bearing on its content, but only on its relation to the knowing subject. The movement of mathematical proof does not belong to the object, but rather is an activity external to the matter at hand. Thus, the nature of the right-angled triangle does not divide itself into parts just the way set forth in the construction necessary for the proof of the proposition that expresses its ratio. The way and the means by which the result is brought forth belong entirely to the cognitive process. In philosophical cognition, too, the way in which the outer existence, qua existence, of a thing comes about is distinct from the way in which its essence or inner nature comes to be.
So it's a lot. He's going to a lot there, but I think this goes back to the idea of that there's no such thing as like real self evidence, right? Like we think, um, it's obvious. Oh yeah, this is what makes a right triangle, right? The way you can slice it up, but really it takes a lot of thinking to look at a triangle and see the different patterns, like to realize that there's a difference between this triangle, right, and okay, whatever, and this triangle, right, like an isosceles triangle, and a kind of um shoot, how to make shapes, how to make shapes. And the right triangle, right? Like, there's the difference between these different ones, and you have to like look at them and understand the pattern. Like, imagine every time you go to school or in every generation, people had to come up with theories of math. Like they had to look at the different patterns of numbers and shapes and things like that, and figure out geometry and invent, trigonometry and things like that. Once again, it would take forever. Like we wouldn't have any progress, right? This is why progress happens, is because we can stack on top of what other people took time to do, right? However, we have to be careful. Like he says, in the last section, we can't just assume that what was done before is just the way it is, and we don't have to question anymore. We can just come up with this new stuff. Because if you don't understand how they got there and how people came up with the right triangle, then you will never really truly understand where we are right now. Right? You never understand. People don't understand today why trigonometry is so powerful. Like why we have to learn it. Like that's the point. Like what, if you hear that all the time? Why would you have to learn this? How do we apply it? You know, people should definitely demand this, but the fact is that that demand is not being met. Right? It's a good thing that people are asking this, but it's bad that we are not encouraging, or teachers are not encouraging, or rather the curriculum, right? The state is not encouraging people to ask these questions and to meet people where they are and to show people why we got this math is valuable, and where it came from and how to use it and things like that. So yeah, Matthew says, and I can put it on the board here, but he says, great point. I would have a hard time distinguishing a right triangle from a non-right triangle if I wasn't taught so. Exactly, right? It seems obvious, but it's something that you have to actually think about. It takes cognizance, and I think that's what he's getting into here. So it's definitely a lot of great stuff.
The construction necessary, the result is brought forth and belong entirely to the cognitive process of a
Yeah.
thing. begin with, philosophical cognition includes both existence and essence, whereas mathematical cognition sets forth only the genesis of the existence, that is, the being of the nature of the thing in cognition as such.
Mm.
What is more, philosophical cognition also unites these two distinct processes. The inner coming to be, or genesis of substance, is an unbroken transition into outer existence, into being for another, and conversely, the genesis of existence is how existence is by itself taken back into essence.
Mm.
The movement is the twofold process and the genesis of the whole, in such wise that each side simultaneously posits the other, and each therefore has both perspectives within itself. Together, they constitute the whole by dissolving themselves and by making themselves into its moments.
That's interesting. And let me look at that real quick. The movement is the twofold process and the genesis of the whole, in such wise that each side simultaneously posits the other, and each therefore has both perspectives within itself. Together, they thus constitute the whole by dissolving themselves and by making themselves into its moments. And so I think that goes back into this whole process of antithesis, of otherness, of negation, of the fact that when you look at something, when you look at a pattern, you look at what is not. Same thing for a mathematical proof or equation, almost like when you're balancing an equation or whatever, you're kind of looking at both sides, and that tells you something about what I'm not great at math, but from the little bit I know, it's interesting that this holds true, for both on a micro level of actually doing the math to a macro level of like thinking about how to understand knowledge in general. Very interesting stuff.
Dissolving themselves. Sections 42 through 46 are going to see Hegel engaging in some criticisms and a broader critique, by the way, those are not exactly the same thing, of
Hmm.
mathematics and of what he calls mathematical cognition, the mathematical way of approaching knowledge. Now, why is he doing this? That's one question we ought to ask ourselves. And another question that we ought to ask ourselves is he really being fair to mathematics as we could understand it today? I tend to think that Hegel is on base with some things and a little bit off base with certain other things. Um, let's think first, as we look at this passage, before we look at what he's trying to say, let's think about what we often mean when we say mathematics or math in American English or maths in British English.
Mm.
What is distinctive to mathematics? We might think of mathematics as a type of cognition, and when we talk about this term cognition, what do we mean? A way of thinking, a way of acquiring knowledge where knowledge wasn't previously.
Hmm. Let me try to take a stab at this. Now, what is mathematics? And I would love to invite others to, if you're listening, or if you're watching later, you can put it in the comments. What do you think is mathematics? Like, how would you describe mathematics? What's the point of it, right? Um, to break it down, I know he's probably going to take a different route, but for me, I think about, like, first thing I thought about was numbers, right? What is the use case of numbers? And it's a unit of measurement, of counting, of being able to look at the world and account for what you see, like being able to store or remember um, what you see, like be able to notate different patterns, essentially, right? Um, in a non-mathematical way, you can describe the patterns that you see in the world. You can say, okay, I've noticed this happens, like the sky turns blue and this, that, and the other, but there's no other way to describe something that happens with a sort of frequency. A frequency. I don't know. I can't say that word correctly, but that happens often, right? Or multiple times. When you begin to notice something happening again, like a cycle, right? Then that gets you to think, okay, wow, I noticed that today the sky was blue. Yesterday the sky was blue, but the day before that the sky was gray, right? So when will the sky be gray again? Right? This is simple stuff, but um, something in our minds allows us to retain these patterns, to notice these patterns in our minds, because I think most other animals don't really care about, or don't really even think or perceive the past, and don't therefore think about the future. It's just present, right? So it's just like we can barely even, I can barely even like explain what that is like. Like, how do you? We say, "Oh, live in the present." I'm going on a tangent now, but we say live in the present, right? But the fact is that the fact that we have a word, an idea for the present, is a sort of, um, I don't know, both a proof, but also like a negation or like a limitation, right? It's a limitation of the fact that we can't not live in the present. Like, and we can't not think about the future and the past. The fact that we have a word for the present means that we're inherently thinking about what's not the present, right? The negation, the opposite of the present, and which is, today or tomorrow. So the fact that we can think about what happens today and then yesterday and then go up to the future tomorrow, we can simulate, right? Means that we have to come up with a different way of knowing things, of knowledge, of retaining information than merely describing things, right? Writing and kind of oration is great for just describing things. It's just telling a story and saying, "Oh, this is what happened, this, that, and the other." But when it comes down to, actually retaining information about patterns that we notice that is, recurring, we we need math, right? This is where we come up with math. Is realizing that we need to say, okay, there's this amount, this amount, this amount, right? Looking at our fingers and saying, oh wow, these are actually pretty similar. These are all very similar structures, but and we can, combine them to we can count them and we say, oh wow, this is how much we have. And the fact that we can make a relation to, this and say this is the same thing. What I mean by that is saying I have one finger and have one cup, right? I have two fingers, but I don't have two cups, right? So the fact that we can relate this idea of an abstract, you know, measurement to, our digits and our experience of the world is pretty amazing. I'm not sure if I'm making sense with all that, but all that to say that I think for us, or for me, math is a unit of measurement. It's a method of understanding the world in inherently, you know, pattern matching way, right? It allows us to match patterns better than any other type of knowledge, because we have the form of knowledge which is just storytelling, which is relating to other people, and other uh, moving around, spatial knowledge and things like that. But this is the form of knowledge. Arithmetic, mathematics is the form of knowledge in which we use to notice patterns and to, you know, put things together in different ways to explain those patterns and then to, build patterns on top of those patterns and so forth and so on. So yeah, that's my take on it. I know he's gonna probably take this a different way. I see his notations here, so let's see what he says. And I would love to see what you all say too. Please put in the comments of your own thoughts on mathematics. I think this is a good exercise.
Another thing that we might think of is the actual discipline embodied in textbooks, embodied in theorems and proofs, embodied in exercises, embodied in equations, embodied in all sorts of things. Mathematics is something that you could go to college to study, as I, in fact, did sort of in a haphazard way. I didn't mean to become a math major. I just started taking calculus classes and liked it, and ended up double majoring in mathematics and philosophy when I was an undergraduate. But doing that meant studying the discipline of mathematics, and as it turns out, mathematics comprises a whole set of other sub-disciplines, some of which are easy to correlate with each other, some of which aren't so easy. We might also think of it as a tool or technique, or as an entire panoply of tools and techniques, particularly when we're thinking of so-called applied mathematics as opposed to pure mathematics. We might also think of it in terms of the experts, the people who, to us, embody mathematics. I tend to think of this as a sort of superstitious attitude to have. It tends to be the sort of thing that people who don't actually know much about mathematics tend to adopt towards those who do seem to know quite a bit about mathematics. And this is a total aside, I think one of the reasons why it's so important for kindergarten through 12th grade and then college students to actually study mathematics is not this, notion that we have that, well, it's going to be so important to balance your checkbook to apply mathematics in your ordinary life. Really, ought to study mathematics, not just so that one can acquire the rigorous habit of mathematical thinking either, but so that one can understand when people are trying to snow you with it. So
Mm.
that one doesn't have an almost idolatrous, peasant-like attitude towards those who can actually do things with numbers.
Mm.
Aristotle said about rhetoric that the reason why people ought to study rhetoric is so that they're not unarmed when other people use it against them,
Mm.
because that's kind of shameful. In his words, unmanly, although, if we
Mm.
can extend this to women as well.
This is a great point too. I haven't even thought about that. And this whole idea is his whole kind of concept of mathematics is a way more high level and abstract in a way than my kind of fundamentalist view. I think, but definitely that idea that we should, are learning things, learning um, higher things, or complicated things, right, allows us to treat other more humanly, right? And in both respects, meaning somebody that appears smarter than you, that knows more than you, um, doesn't like you said, doesn't throw you off. Doesn't be like, oh wow, I need to praise this human. They know things I could never even conceive of. They must be otherworldly or godly or whatever. Like, nah, they just study this thing, right? Um, and it goes the other way too, in that uh you don't disrespect other people who have studied something differently, right? Like if you have studied math, but somebody else has studied science, right? You can kind of appreciate where they're coming from, and like they may not know as much about math as you, but you can respect how much they put into learning science, or maybe the way they apply their math, right, could be different than what you thought could be possible. Like you apply math to this, and they apply math to that, and you're like, oh wow, it's a whole different thing. But yeah, I think that's an interesting take too. I still hold that we shouldn't be like forcing all kids to learn math the way that we do. I think that's a complete mistake, and just like it really divorces the very uh, enjoyment and value of math. But if we could make it easier for people to engage in learning about math or any other subject in a more holistic and passionate way, in a more curiosity driven way, in a more organic way, then I think that will be way more powerful, and that will achieve this goal that he's talking about here. But yeah, I think that's a great point there. I see that all the time with people who who know economics, or like you hear this, for instance. I'm going on another tangent here, but this is a freaking great point. Like they say, oh, who are you to critique him, right? Who are you to critique this for instance, this musician about their music? Or who are you to critique this scientist about the science, or this mathematician about this math, or this economist about their the economy? And that, yes, you do need some understanding of knowledge, but the fact is, when people say that, they don't mean, oh, you don't know enough. They just mean that I don't understand what this person is saying. Therefore, they must be this godly, being, and nobody else should question them. It's an inherently authoritarian, outlook, right? That you shouldn't critique this person because you're not on that level. But no, like if we all have some understanding of how math works, or how or economics work, or how this works, you don't have to be an expert, but so long as you understand the fundamentals, the principles behind it, the technique, the disciplines, things like that, then you can be conversant, right? You can critique. All right. I do agree that you shouldn't really critique if you're ignorant, completely ignorant, you have no idea what the hell you're talking about. But if understand like the basics here, the fundamentals, then yeah, you should be able to critique that stuff. You shouldn't look at a person and be like, oh, they're untouchable because they're so far beyond me. Like, no, they're another human. Yes, they spent more time on this thing, but if you understand the fundamentals, you can have a conversation about it. So yeah, this is a great point, and I like that he went into this.
And I think we should say the same thing about mathematics. I think it's appalling that many students in the United States adopt this popular attitude of, I don't really need to know mathematics, and mathematics is so tough, and it's
Hmm.
beyond me. It's not really beyond anybody.
Right, exactly.
That's my little soapbox thing, which I rarely indulge in. But I think it's useful to think in terms of mathematics as not just being one thing. We have to be a little bit careful with it. Hegel is mainly talking about mathematics as a type of cognition here. And he says that when we're looking at mathematics, when we look at mathematical truths, if somebody has only memorized equations and they don't understand why they ought to have them in mind or what they would be used for or why the equations would work out the way they are, they don't really know mathematics. They don't really have knowledge. He says, knowing them outwardly by rote without knowing their proofs, knowing them inwardly, that's what it is to know something through a proof. It's not enough even just to memorize the proof. You have to be able to, you have to have developed a facility with constructing proofs. You have to know how to get from point A to point B and not be lost along the way. Otherwise, you're really just relying on other people's maps, other people's landmarks. You haven't really made it your own inwardly. And remember, the phenomenology is all about us making inward, appropriating the entire historical development of human consciousness. So mathematics is a part of that. And we wouldn't consider somebody to actually know mathematics who can only reproduce things and doesn't actually understand them. But here's the problem, Hegel says. With mathematical knowledge, we have the proofs. And so, imagine your way back to, say, geometry class. I remember taking high school geometry, just hated it. College geometry, loved it. You know why? Because in high school geometry, all we did was play around with, protractors and compasses and do constructions, and there was never any sense of why the hell we were doing this. We had to, memorize proofs and go through them, and there was no sense of what are we actually doing here. I needed the why. In college, I was fortunate enough to take my geometry class with somebody who was a theory guy and really loved explaining and unpacking.
Yeah, this is the same reason why code, like I couldn't learn coding. I tried, like I went to a whole boot camp, finished the whole boot camp somehow because I was able to like memorize a bunch of stuff, but I didn't understand like the why. I'm like, I kept asking like, why do we code this? Like, why do we, put this in here? And why does this language, use periods and commas this way and all this stuff? And I was trying to break it down into the, the machine code, and I went down into the quantum physics of how computers work. But all that was on my own time, and there's no like the instructors didn't really engage in explaining why code worked the way it did. And maybe if I had more time or if I had a better teacher, I can get back into it. But I'm into design right now, and I love that stuff because it's all about the why. Like you have to learn the why. I mean, well, unfortunately, there's a whole number of designers who don't know anything about the why. It's just it looks pretty, But UX design and good UX designers have to learn the why. You have to learn why this just all principle, this design principle works and when it doesn't work, like why we do things this way, why white space matters and how it matters and what situations and for what people and all this other stuff, like psychology and ethics and all these other things. Anyways, yeah, I really like going back to what I was saying before in terms of our education system. We have to engage people in learning that why and the underlying reasons behind these things and logic and stuff like that.
Hacking these sorts of things in a Hegelian sense, going and taking the inner and making it outward, taking the outward and showing the internality to it, if you can understand what we're talking about there. And Hegel says that what happens with mathematical cognition is people, they do use the proof, they do derive the proof, and the proof is connected with its result in the process of proving it. But then after that's done, you don't really need the proof anymore. It becomes purely ancillary. Sort of like a beetle shedding its old skin, once it's grown new skin. And people are content with this. And he starts talking in terms of existence, and that might throw you a bit. He's talking in terms of essence and existence, and mathematics is primarily about existence. Why the hell is he talking about that? Because mathematical knowledge is existing as something external for the knowing subject. When we're talking about knowledge, we must never forget that knowledge exists for a knowing subject. Knowledge exists in somebody's mind, in their understanding, their intellect. And the knowing subject is sort of extraneous. It does, think about mathematics. A mathematical proof should be true and should work no matter who you're dealing with. It could be, some people are too stubborn or too lazy to actually comprehend it, or they've got some cognitive disabilities that keep them from doing it, or they're so, beset by anxiety that they can't do it. But in general, if there aren't any handicaps of that sort, somebody should be able to understand mathematics to make sense of it and to be able to get from here to here. And then, of course, they can leave that proof behind. Hegel says, the result, it's as a result that the theorem is something seen to be true. But this added circumstance has no bearing on its content, only on its relation to the knowing subject. So, you could do mathematics in a certain way just by going through textbooks. And, what textbooks in mathematics really are, they're put together by people who are experts in mathematics, and they're designed to get you through what it is that they've learned in the process. And they do give you the proofs, but a lot of people just skip over those and they go to the results. Even very smart people. Hegel says the way this works for philosophical cognition is different. He says the way in which the outer existence, qua existence of a thing, comes about is distinct from the way in which its essence or inner nature comes to be. So we have this play between existence, the outer, and essence, the inner. What happens in philosophical cognition is that these are not separated off from each other. They actually undergo a kind of twisting and turning. The essence, that which is inner, has to be made external and thereby become existence. He says
Interesting.
it this way. The inner coming to being, or genesis of substance, is an unbroken transition into outer existence, into being for another, being for the knowing subject. So as we think, for example, about the nature of mathematics, we're doing philosophical cognition. We ask ourselves, what is mathematics? We try to grasp its essence, and then we have to externalize it into determinate existence.
Right.
And then he says, at the very same time, what's going on in philosophical cognition, the genesis of existence is how existence is by itself taken back into essence. We look at the individual, the particular, the happens to be here at this point in time, and we try to find what's really essential, what it has in common with other things, what it has to speak to us about more than just itself, what is inward in it. So the outer becomes inner, the inner becomes outer, and this process is continually ongoing, so that we can't just say, all right, we got the result, screw the proofs, screw the process of figuring this out. No, in philosophical cognition, all of this still remains part of the process. Again, that's why the phenomenology has to lead us through all these previous shapes of consciousness.
Beautiful, beautiful. I had a few thoughts in there. I was like thinking about it's like a flower, you know, the seed or the bud on the inside. Uh, as it grows, as you that knowledge, you can say that flowers like that bud is like the knowledge, but as it grows, it comes outside, right, and becomes the thing that you're appreciating. So likewise for a lot of math or many other things, as you're trying to understand an idea, right, you're trying to piece into the inside and grow it, right. You're trying to, as you understand it, it's basically growing and opening up to you in front of you. You can, and then once you know enough about it, you can kind of appreciate its beauty. um I feel like that could be a poem. Not how I said it, but it's that concept. I got to make some poetry. But yeah, it's very very amazing and beautiful how much our knowledge and education and just information in general is just so dynamic, and you know so much to learn. So very excited to once again dive into the rest of this. I need to stop procrastinating. Always coming up with excuses. Sometimes I get like so tired after work. I'm just like, next week. But I really want to work through this. So I need to be better and maybe even do multiple videos a week. I don't know. But as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Please let me know your thoughts, what you learned from this. Feel free to put that down in the comments. If you want to hear more about me or from me, I have more stuff in the description. And yeah. Oh, Matthew says, "How do you get started in philosophy, Elijah?" Um, I don't know. Just I've always been interested in philosophy. Just because I've always been like very curious. about things. And always been like asking questions. I think it probably came from like fiction books because I've just been into fiction books for most of my life, and I've almost never read any nonfiction books. Um, but in many of those fiction books, they have like people would either talk about philosophy and say like have philosophical concepts and things like that, and that you know brought me into these kind of ideas into thinking these sorts of things. You'd be surprised of how many, or maybe not if you read fiction books, but how many of these stories, introduce extremely, incredibly, philosophical ideas in their pages by these different characters and different concepts from the books, and even the plots, right? The worlds that they talk about. Um, like one of the one that I always go back to, especially relevant to today's metaverse stuff. But um, Connor Costick's Epic. I read that back in elementary school. I forget what grade I was in, third, fourth, fifth, or something like that. But Epic is about a kind of far future world where they're living in a real world, but they work in a sort of virtual world, and they have to actually work in this virtual world to make real world money. And so the main character in the beginning, goes to fight a dragon to earn real world money for his parents and things like that. There's some other stuff in there I probably don't remember, but what it got super interesting when and I'm spoiling it here, but it's kind of an old book by this point. Um so spoiler warning, but the main villain of the book is a vampire in the virtual world, right? And that vampire has lived for a very long time in the virtual world. And what's super interesting is that the vampire becomes sentient. It becomes aware that it's living in a simulation, and it tries to infect the main character and some other people to in order for it to leave the simulation. It's crazy, right? This is a I don't know if it was a child's book per se, but it's definitely like a preteen kind of teen, book. And so at an early age, I was sitting there like, huh, what machines be sentient? Like, what would that look like? And what would it take for a virtual world to become real? And if the virtual world and the real world is indistinguishable, then is it just as real? And that led me to like things like Plato's cave theory and the butterfly, theory and all this other stuff. And it's just amazing how much, I don't know, stuff you can learn from just reading fiction. So even though I tend to like just over the past couple of weeks, I haven't made very much content because I've been reading a book called The Monot Loop. Um, and that one's another trippy story about this kid being stuck in a infinite loop in a it wasn't really infinite, but in a kind of time loop where he has to redo this thing over and over again. And it goes into all these types of concepts and everything like that. It just got me thinking once again about the nature of reality and eternity and time and power and responsibility and all this other stuff. So really, I guess fiction, fiction books has been the biggest thing that got me into philosophy. And I don't know much of traditional theories. Like I don't know anything about like the great Greeks and all this other stuff. Most of the stuff that he talks about here, I don't really understand, or I understand because I've heard it vaguely, but I haven't really read much of this stuff. Most of the stuff I've learned about philosophy is probably from fiction books. But yeah, I think it's a valid way of learning this stuff, of getting into it, especially if you give it the time to really think about what the authors were getting at. Um, but yeah, it's super interesting stuff, and that's my story there. So yeah, hope that answered your question. I guess it did. And as always, once again, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And Matthew, thanks for engaging. I really appreciate it. Matthew says, "What an interesting start in philosophy." Yeah, yeah. I love to hear. Like, did you, what is your starting philosophy, or do you read philosophical stuff? I don't know. I would love to hear that stuff about your own experiences. But feel free to put that in the comments as well below because I am tired. It's my nap time. Well, it's way past my nap time. Probably have to go make dinner. But yeah, thanks for again for the fifth time, and have a great day. See y'all. Bye bye.